Do we get, well, I guess we still have 1 minute to go. We'll wait until 5.
Yes, we have a few more joining.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, we have.
All right, it's 5:01. Do we have lots more people joining, Christina, or should we get started?
I think we can get started. There's
Okay.
a few more board members who will straggle in, but
Okay. All right. Well, good evening and thank you for joining the September 30th, 2024 Policy Committee meeting. I'm Ruth Fortune, your new policy chair, and I look forward to diving into this work with all of you. On today's agenda, we will be hearing an overview of the Blue Ribbon Commission and then reviewing the first reading of the Title IX policy. I ask that as your item comes up, please introduce yourself and your title. And now I'll turn it over to our chairperson, Jennifer Hockenhall, to give an intro of the Blue Ribbon Commission overview.
Thanks, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Blue Ribbon Commission co-chairs and to Nick for joining us tonight to talk a little bit more. I know that we've had some rich discussion at the board level about kind of what's going on, and I thought nothing better would be than to bring in the experts that we have here to talk more about it. So I will just turn it over to the three of you, and then I will turn it back to the chair of the committee to ask for questions and things like that, if that works.
Sure. Thank you so much. So good evening, Dr. Torres Rodriguez, Chair Fortune, esteemed members of the Policy Committee and the HPS team. On behalf of the Blue Ribbon Commission, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. We do have a slide deck, which Nick is going to help us with. I think I know most of you, but for those who I do not, my name is Andrea Comer. I am joined by one of my co-chairs, Kate Carbone. Our other co-chair, Hector Rivera, regrets he was unable to join us this evening. Also joining us is Nick, as I mentioned, from Diligent Red, who has supported our work and will navigate our presentation because walking and chewing gum is not easy for me all the time. So next slide, please. So our agenda for this conversation is a three-parter, right? An overview of the commission, a look at our work and schedule, and then we'd love to hear from you, and Kate will guide us in that conversation. Next slide. So the commission has 12 members representing the state, the district, and the city, as well as educators, parents of Hartford students, and a representative of the business community. Including your board chair, Jen Hockenhall. The commission is what brings us together, but what binds us, I think, is a deep commitment to education for Hartford students, something that I know we all share. Next slide. So our mission, vision, and promise are on this slide for your review. But I wanted to ground our conversation in the shared commitment that I mentioned. I'm sure most, if not all of you, read with mixed emotions the Connecticut Mirror article about Alicia, Hartford student who graduated from our system unable to read. And I say mixed emotions because on the one hand, we have to question how that happened. But on the other hand, Alicia reminded us of how resilient our children are, and how even in the darkest of times, they are heroes in their universe. So I read Alicia's story and thought about the work of this board, this commission, and everyone who believes in the promise and potential of our children. It's why our promise is to create an environment where all students can thrive, because as Alicia showed us, they're ready and they need us. Next slide. So in terms of the commission's work, this slide represents our focus. What we're not trying to do is oversee the work of the district. What we're not doing is developing a strategic plan for the district. You and your board colleagues are doing that. We're also not auditing the district. As you know, the State Department of Education is doing that. What we are hoping to do is to look at every public education offering in Hartford, reviewing available data for the entire ecosystem, whether it's a magnet, open choice, or public charter school, and exploring, I guess, opportunities for improvement in that ecosystem. Those opportunities may come in the way of policy recommendations or suggestions on ways to leverage additional resources. We have no interest in doing this work in a silo, because that won't get us anywhere. And it's why we're here, hoping to engage your thought partnership and your leadership. And so with that, and with appreciation for your time, I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Andrea. Nick, just next slide. Thank you for inviting us to share the overview of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And thank you to Jennifer for having lots of different hats, serving both as the board chair and also on the commission. I'd like to just kind of give you an overview of where we are in the work, what we've done thus far, and where we are going. And secondly, to the thank yous, Dr. Torres Rodriguez will be joining us in our next meeting to give an overview of the Hartford Public Schools context. And as Andrea shared, the ecosystem of Hartford is complex and unique. And looking at it through one lens and having just one person try to be, or a board be, a superhero to ensure that the highest quality education is delivered to Hartford Public School students, we know that's just a Herculean ask and task. And so how can we create this commission to be as comprehensive enough to look at all of the factors that go into the Hartford context, and what are the recommendations, both short-term and long-term at the policy and local level, that can impact and leverage resources for the highest outcome for all of our students and families. If you can go to the next slide, I can just give a bit of an overview. August and September really was an opportunity for the commission members to meet one another and to dive in and dig into identifying the themes and patterns that we wanted to explore over the 6 months that we'll be together. The 6 months starting in August and ending in December will culminate with a comprehensive report that looks at all of the data, both human and interpersonal data, as well as data around finance and more quantitative data that yield for us what the picture of Hartford in the greater context would look like. In October, we will dive into meeting with our subcommittees and in our greater committee format to review and examine the different data sources that we are collecting. And as I shared earlier, Dr. Torres Rodriguez is going to be coming and speaking to the commission. During our last meeting, Elizabeth Horton-Sheff spoke, as well as our companions and friends over at the CREC Regional Resource Center, who also operate the magnet schools within Hartford. And it was important for them to partner with us, because not only can they shed light on the experiences of students within the CREC magnet schools, but also families in Hartford who choose the choice, open choice system. And so they will be partnering with us and allowing for us to meet with different stakeholder groups within both of those buckets, relative to both open choice families and their experiences and students and their outcomes, as well as CREC magnet families and their outcomes. In November and December, we'll be looking at the data and really diving into the report and putting fine touches on that report to have it prepared for the public. You'll notice that both in October and November, we're toggling between hybrid and virtual meetings so that we can be as user-friendly to the community, to engage as many stakeholders as possible who can also join in these meetings, as well as we will do the same for our subcommittee meetings. And they are also live streamed on YouTube. Next slide, Nick. As Andrea had shared, there are 3 co-chairs, and earlier in our October and September work, we worked within the commission to identify themes that continue to resonate across the 12 members on the commission. And those subcommittee topics ended up fleshing out as connected school safety and community partnerships, academic programming and processes, and operational and strategic planning. Within each of those topic areas, we distilled our work into 2 to 3 themes that we'll be exploring, whether that is in one-to-one meetings, focus groups, or surveys. And within each of the subgroup committee meeting topics, you'll see that under connectedness and safety and community partnerships, there's 2 themes. What is not written, it's a subtext, and I will explain it it's true for each of the subcommittees. The topic of trust and connectedness works across the ecosystem. So trust and connectedness, not only within family structures, within a school, the school district, the magnet school environment, or open choice, but it is ubiquitous across all of the ecosystem. So I just want to put that caveat out there. And then cross-sector collaboration were 2 of the major themes that came up for that committee. And that is being the co-chair is Hector Rivera, and he has met multiple times with his subcommittee. I'm spearheading the academic programming and processes, again, looking across the full context of Hartford, the educational system in Hartford. And our themes have fleshed out into the equitable and inequitable distribution of resources across schools within both the Hartford context, open choice context, and CREC context, and lack of alignment of high quality instruction within those areas, what defines high quality instruction. And then lastly, Andrea is the co-chair of the operations and strategic planning, and they have 3 themes that they're diving into. Looking at budget constraints due to less than full funding at the state level, enrollment in facilities across multiple of the, both at the CREC resource, CREC environment, as well as the Hartford Public Schools environment. And then looking at fiscal oversight and transparency regarding staffing and other challenges, including transportation. You'll see below each of those areas of themes, we have identified stakeholder groups that each of our committees will be interacting with. It does not mean that because Hartford students are listed under the academic programming component, does not mean that we're not going to be engaging students in inquiring about their experience relative to what is appropriate for them to understand and answer around connectedness and school safety or community safety and partnerships, and similarly around funding resources and access to high quality programs. You'll see that each of our committees have identified the stakeholder groups that we'll be engaging with, and within our subcommittees, there will be 2 members engaging with those stakeholder groups. Again, that will be through one-to-one interviews, focus groups, and surveys. Next slide, Nick. Our next steps as both subcommittee groups and as a larger commission, we will be administering surveys. We have collected as randomized data from both CREC and Hartford Public Schools, and also working in unison with the state on public available data. We will be conducting our interviews and focus groups based on the surveys and folks' willingness to participate in the commission. And we will continue our subcommittee and full commission meetings throughout the month of October, November, and December. Lastly, at each of our meetings, we are inviting various players, whether it is a superintendent, CAO, or the executive directors within the magnet and charter system to speak to the commission, to allow the commission to understand the broader context within the Hartford educational ecosystem. And with that, we would like to open up and facilitate a discussion for members of the policy committee. And I'm going to start with 2 questions that you may have been mulling about as we were sharing with you our work. What resonates with you based on our presentation, and how can the Blue Ribbon Commission complement the work being done by both Harvard Public Schools right now through the strategic planning process and the State Department of Education? So I'm going to just start with those 2 and open it up to the committee.
I'm curious to hear more about the surveys that you're doing. So who are you reaching out to and what types of questions are being asked?
Sure. Within our themes, we broke down the themes into a variety of questions that would illuminate a better understanding for the commission members with regard to policy funding, and then nuances within each of those topics. The way that we are engaging with surveys will, and I'm going to speak to what we have already solidified with CREC and Open Choice, 2 different methods that we're going to be using. And then Nick, I will let you speak to the greater survey for the Hartford in general. In reference to CREC, they are sending the first survey, which is a inquiry survey of what people's willingness to participate, with a definition and description of what the Hartford Blue Ribbon Commission's goal, vision and mission and goals are. Based on that, we will follow up with those folks with a deeper survey, depending upon what focus group area or what stakeholder group it is, whether it's a family, student, or a staff member. Nick, I'm going to let you kind of talk through the Hartford version of that.
Yeah, no, happy to. And it's a pleasure to meet everybody. My name is Nick Stolatano. Like Kate and Andrea said, I'm the managing director of Dillinger Research and Applied Data. We're a Connecticut-based nonprofit that has worked closely with Hartford in the past and works with surrounding districts and actually across the country as well. So as Kate was mentioning, the survey approach is complex, but also trying to be very complementary. Ideally, at the end of the day, as Kate had sort of identified, within each of the sub areas, we're trying to grapple with what we are feeling are basically our hypotheses are some of the major challenges that are being faced within each of those areas. So part of the survey responsibility is to both gather information around those challenges, identify and understand the context across a wide range of stakeholders, and then eventually, as we get into that November timeframe, when we think about recommendations, get feedback around the recommendations themselves. What we don't want to do, as we've heard, because we've been working very closely with Dr. Ratley and other folks, is to sort of, I would say, inundate and overwhelm folks with a lot of surveys. So our first step in this process has been to really sort of understand what surveys exist and can we leverage that data accordingly. So for instance, The culture and climate surveys that are pushed out regularly through Hartford Public Schools is one of the set of surveys that we're trying to get our hands on, anonymized wise, so that we can understand, okay, are there information that we can cull from that survey without having to re-ask the same questions and sort of re-engage. As you saw, again, the stakeholder sort of engagement plan encompasses a lot of different focus groups, a lot of different interviews. And so we're trying to use the survey to both, as Kate mentioned, build out our understanding of what the Blue Ribbon Commission is, identify who wants to take part in those, and then sort of fill the gaps with the wide range of stakeholders that we need. I'm sure you can appreciate the fact, right? There are a set of parents that are going to neighborhood schools, to charter schools within Hartford, charter schools outside of Hartford, Prec magnet schools, Hartford magnet schools, vocational schools. So it probably will be, given the time constraints that we have, near impossible to sit down in a significant way with all of those types of parents. And so we're trying to leverage the survey in such a way that we can hopefully cover as much ground as possible. Excellent question, though.
Thank you. I know I think both Ms. Colmer and Dr. Carbone referred to the strategic planning that we're doing within HPS. And we are also planning to send out surveys and to reach out to a large number of people. Is there some way to find some synergy between the two and not have to duplicate the efforts and possibly costs with that? And also the timeline is somewhat similar as well.
Yeah, I would, two things that I want to be really mindful of, and I'm sure you as well, you may, as the board and Dr. Torres Rodriguez, maybe asking very specific questions around your strategic planning process that leads to action items that you're going to enact within the Hartford Public Schools context specific. And I do think that there's an opportunity for us to piggyback on some of the survey, and we certainly could share the questions that we have intended to put out and have folks react to. Because we're looking at this broader context, they're very our questions tend to be very broad in nature, and not as specific as you may end up getting because of the strategic planning process and the work that you're going to end up doing. We definitely would like to partner with and create some synergistic timing, especially given that whatever information we have would only benefit the Hartford Public Schools, and similarly, information that you get would benefit the commission. So I can, Dr. Ratley is on the commission, so I can definitely, and she's on my committee in particular, we can definitely talk through that to make sure that we're being more mindful of the upcoming surveys that you might be putting out.
If I may too, could I kind of piggyback off of that? Do you all have a sense on when you are looking to do surveys and focus groups yourselves, given the, what else is happening in the fall outside of, Thanksgiving and Christmas and whatnot? So just out of curiosity.
Hi, I can answer that. We have a two-phased approach where through the month of October, we will be engaging community in surveys, focus groups, and community conversations. And then there's a circle loop back around November, December to kind of go back and share, the themes and the trends, and do another pulse check with community to see if we, captured everything or if we missed anything. So there's kind of like a two-part, and I can certainly share that timeline and progression with the commission.
No, that I appreciate that, Dr. Torres. Thank you. Because we essentially are ready to go. We have all our surveys, ready. So would love to just jump in and partner. And again, as Kate mentioned, identify those synergies that could work most effectively. So very much appreciate that idea.
Looks like Board Member Tatum, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, everybody. I think I'll build to a question, but starting with the question of what resonates, I think I resonate with the commission's approach of starting from these hypotheses about what some of the issues are in the not just internal to Harvard Public Schools, but looking at the broader context. I think that that is a perspective that is beyond the scope of what we often concern ourselves with the board, and I think is an important difference between the commission's work and the strategic planning process. That in the strategic plan, we're looking at, what do we hope for Harvard Public Schools, like the 10-year vision, right? And then thinking back now, okay, so then what in the next 3 years do we do as Harvard Public Schools itself? So the way I've been thinking about it is that is more kind of internally focused. And sure, maybe some of what comes up in that process is ways that we might try to engage other, bigger systems, but mainly we're thinking about Harvard Schools itself. And I think one thing that I'm really curious to see in your findings with your particular angle is what kind of recommendations come that do speak to some of the bigger context and the ways that there are so many of these players here. Because I think, it's one thing if we stay somewhat siloed and, CREC has its legislative priorities and we have our legislative priorities and the charter schools are trying to get their thing done. And it a little bit feels to me like in some ways, like everyone's kind of like looking out for themselves and their own interests as educational systems, for good reasons. Like we're all doing good work. But I'm curious to see with this particular perspective that this commission is bringing, like what emerges as like ways that actually on behalf of the children of Harford County more broadly, like how do these systems need to work better together? And let's like better understand what the differences really are. Like we've set up this very complicated ecosystem and what results are we getting? I think that is not very well understood. So I guess there's not really a question buried in here. It's more just like how I'm sorting out the difference between the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing on the strategic plan. Is a difference of perspective and sort of locus of control or something. So I guess what I'm saying is like, yes, let's like make sure to try to combine and align as much as possible, but also recognize that we're doing two separate things and that we don't want to conflate the two things and then wind up with something that's not serving either purpose as well as it could if we let them have their own space. I don't envy you. That's a hard task, but that's kind of how it lands for me at this point.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Board Member Tatum. Looks like Board Member Brody, you have your hand raised.
Yes, and I may go in and out. So if you can't hear me, please let me know because I'm going through an area that does that. I do have some concerns from what I seen when I did watch the last Blue Ribbon meeting. What it appeared to me is like, because when some of the committee members are saying like, how was that captured? It appeared to me that some of the statements that were being made was not because engagement was done. It to me appeared to be the preconceived notions of those whomever like wrote it out. So if we're doing work, find out exactly what is going on and how families are family and others are feeling in our community about Hartford Public Schools, instead of going in with an open mind, some of the statements that, oh, we're going to look more into this, did not seem like, it seemed like it was automatically like negative, like it's a problem, as opposed to what exactly are we dealing with and how are we going to get to identify these things of what's wrong in our community. So that is what I got from watching the working meeting.
Board Member Brody, could you give us an example? I'm not, just so I can better understand sort of where you think there were preconceived notions. I know you weren't on at the very beginning when we talked about what the work of the commission is and isn't, but if you could give us an example, I think that would be super helpful.
Is one example that I wish I could call upon. It was it just escaping me now. But the second one was, like it was already said that there's mistrust between families in the school. So that was one of the things, looking into the mistrust between families in the school. As if it was, you surveyed people, you talked to people at the school, you talked to families, and that was something that you needed to look into, instead of leading with, there is distrust. That was one of them.
Andrea, could I speak to that, or?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
No, I believe you are correct in your sort of statement around that. And I'll sort of identify that was sort of the design of how we needed to attack the problem, so to speak. Given the fact, as Kate mentioned, it's actually not 6 months now, it's actually 5 months. And it's actually even less than that, given the time constraints that we're facing. There's two sort of ways we could have approached the work. One is to start off with stakeholder engagement, start off with a broad survey and what's known as sort of boiling the ocean in regards to identifying and understanding the greatest needs that are identified through stakeholder engagement. Given the fact that it was August and that school was starting and the formative assessments were taking place and the board was meeting to do theirs and the state was also doing their meetings, given that whole picture, we knew that probably would not be a viable option in which to start from the ground up. If we had an entire year, I would absolutely be all for that approach in regards to, again, starting from the ground up, building understanding, and then working from there. To do what we need to do within the short amount of time span, the board, or the Blue Ribbon Commission, much like the board, is put together because of the expertise and the speciality that come with all of our members. And so from that perspective, it was kind of decided to say, okay, using your all's experience and your time that you've been spending in Hartford and your in-depth knowledge of your experience, we are starting with you all to start with your hypotheses. And if we start with a set of hypotheses that we can align on, part of then the stakeholder engagement is to confirm those hypotheses. So I completely agree with you, right? Like, have we confirmed them yet? Absolutely not. That is what we're hoping to do with the stakeholder engagement. We want to, for the very example that you gave, we want to go in and talk and survey and engage with the stakeholders to say, like, is there a trust issue? If they say no, great. That's awesome. We'll get rid of that and we'll start either developing another hypothesis or going with the ones that we were able to confirm with. But at the end of the day, it was really more of a project management approach to say, okay, start with the hypotheses, either disprove or prove the hypotheses, and build those recommendations around the hypotheses that we were able to prove and get support around.
Do you, Madam Chair, follow up? Do you mind, Ms. Fortune?
Oh, so your hand is still raised. Are you all set?
No, I had a follow-up. I said,
Oh, yes,
am I
please,
able
please
to?
proceed. Yes, you have the floor.
So I feel that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You'll find someone to agree with what you're looking for, and it's negative in nature. That's my opinion of it all. Is negative in nature, and you're leading with that. So that's why for me, I wasn't the least bit excited about it. I normally would be excited about anything that is going to improve the lives of young people in this city. But it does come off, like I said, negative, because you're leading with negative statements. You're saying these are problems, but you're not getting that. At least you're not getting that from anyone very, very close to the work of, like, the people who are working with families, our families. So it might be a hypothesis. You might be trying to disprove it or prove it, but to me, it's more like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So completely agree with, we have to be very careful. I think that's one of the reasons why we are so eager to try to have such a wide reach for stakeholder engagement. We have been working with Dr. Ratley since the beginning, actually since the end of August, around identifying times to meet with admin, meet times with staff, to engage with students, to engage with parents. Part of what we're really trying to emphasize is the idea that, to your point, we want to hear from everybody and we want to understand at the end of the day what is happening. I think generally speaking, and I completely appreciate your point around, it would be better to start with what's working than what's not working. But the Blue Ribbon Commission's sole purpose is to develop a set of recommendations to help improve the overall educational ecosystem. And so because of that mission, I'm not saying it's a waste of time to focus on what's good. I think it's always good to understand what's working. But again, given the time frame, the recommendations need to be figuring out what to help support and improve moving forward, and not to just reinforce what's also working. I mean, I think it is a total point that you make that's really good, that it is a juggling act. That one, that's why we're here to talk with you all today about how can we best get in front of everybody. We do not want to be selective. And it's been really hard to try and understand and identify those stakeholders. So for that, we are looking to you all. Please help us get in front of as many parents and as many students, as many staff as possible. We will not turn anybody away.
Lastly, Madam Chair, I'll just state that it's hard. It will be extremely hard for me to get with and partner with you when you're leading with negative statements, like you're predicting negativity as experiences for our family. So that's not something that I'm willing to walk along with when it's led in that particular way. And that's all, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your comments, Board Member Brody. Do we have any other questions coming from anyone? Oh, I see quite a few hands raised. I'll go with Board Member Darristal Ledger.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the presentation so far. So I wanted to be, and I apologize for my camera being off. I'm driving right now. I just wanted to just be clear with regards to the role and the duties of this Blue Ribbon Commission. It is not it's not to do any strategic planning or auditing, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much. And the other question I have is, do you have any dates in mind, or are you looking to have some type of community engagement to kind of gather data? Because I do recall during the presentation, there was one statement made about human data, and if you can just speak to the effects of that.
Yeah, our next set of work for the month of October is to create as many pathways, systems, and processes that we can naturally get feedback from families in Hartford. And so as each of our subcommittees is doing the work, there has been, suggestions, everything from attending NRZs to community events to, we have both with CREC as well as with Hartford Public Schools, that we would engage with what is naturally happening within the schools so that we could get natural feedback through either a survey interaction and or setting up future focus groups and one-to-ones. So our other two questions is, how would you like us to ensure that we engage, thoroughly and completely with as many stakeholders as possible? That is actually the part that each of our subcommittees is trying to do without stepping on one another and over engaging with a group, as was brought up earlier around strategic planning. And I do want to offer one distinction, and board member Brody, to your point, the complexity of a family member and a student in Hartford, that family could experience 3 different to 5 different types of schooling experiences, from a vocational experience to a open choice experience to a Hartford neighborhood experience to a Hartford magnet. And many of our families do have that many vast relationships and differences within the way they engage with the ecosystem. That's really important as we look at the vision and mission statement, and also the ask of this commission at the end to make recommendations, policy recommendations, both locally and statewide, because the complexity of that and the interconnectedness and symbiosis is really important, but it has to be designed as such. And so the question, although it was coming from the hypothesis of it is not there, it's not an intended to be negative. It's intended to either prove or disprove a hypothesis that we have.
Thank you. Board Member Darcel Ledger, do you have any follow-up questions?
I do not. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It looks like the superintendent has her hand raised.
I have a clarifying question relative to the ecosystem, and I saw CREC, Open Choice, Charters, other magnet operators as well, such as Goodwin.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a new player. It's new to the equation.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I had missed it or if there's. I understand now. Thank you. So essentially, across the strands, the inquiries are across all the players.
Yes.
Across the strands and across the players. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
We ran out of fruit. My apologies for the visual.
All right, wonderful. Board Member Cheatham, do you have your hand raised? Perfect, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think picking up a little bit on what the superintendent was getting at there, one question I have is these recommendations that you're coming up with, I think I've understood them as being recommendations primarily for Hartford, but are you open to, in this process of, investigating and kind of engaging with all the players in the ecosystem, like, could there be recommendations that come from this commission for some of these other players or for the state? Are you looking at that level as well?
No, I think we are looking at those players that impact Hartford students, because the commission itself was impaneled as a City of Hartford, effort. So we would not necessarily be making recommendations that would impact municipalities beyond the City of Hartford. I mean, I guess I suppose they could, depending upon what those recommendations are, but any recommendations would be centered on the interests of Hartford children and families.
I mean, would you acknowledge that, like, there are institutions that are not Hartford Public Schools that do like have whose policies and whose, priorities do have an impact on Hartford students, whether they're specifically educating Hartford students in their system, or as a player in the ecosystem in which Hartford is also a part, like what they do has some impact on Hartford as well.
Can you give me an example?
I think I can.
And
Andrea.
actually, I would love for him to answer the question, if that's okay, Nick.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm like trying to wrap my head more around the complexity of this ecosystem and how much of it comes down to funding, like there are, and funding from the state, right? Like there are ways in which, the way that funding moves from Hartford to open choice schools or from Hartford to prep schools, affects what we are able to do in Hartford with our budget. And like those are policies that I don't understand very well yet, but it seems to me like we Hartford, like a recommendation to Hartford, if you're only looking at what we as Hartford Public Schools could do, is more limited than a recommendation to what Hartford and CREC and Goodwin and, the open choice system more broadly could accomplish for the sake of, whatever subgroup of students we're talking about.
Right.
I guess I'm just wondering if if this investigation is framed open enough to think about what all of us as players in the ecosystem could do together, or are you only looking at recommendations to be made specifically to Hartford?
So specifically to Hartford children, but not specifically to Hartford Public Schools.
Okay, that makes sense. And then my second quick question was, someone mentioned earlier that that one of the sources of data that you were hoping to use as you begin to test these hypotheses was the climate and culture survey data that already exists. It seems to me that that would be a good source of information because that was all harvested before any hypotheses were made about what problems might be. And so it sounded though like you had not yet seen the data that was relevant to your questions from those surveys. Is that correct?
Yeah, specifically to that, it is publicly available on Hartford Public Schools website by school, which is cool. But what we're looking for is that holistic view. And so, yes, Superintendent and Paul have been really great in working with us to connect us with different folks across the district to help us understand and get those anonymized pieces of data. So that's been really helpful. We're in the process of getting that data as we speak.
Okay, sounds good. That's all my questions. Thank you.
I don't think I see any other hands up. I do have a couple of questions. Now that we've sort of dived deeper and have a better understanding, I appreciate that because of time constraint, you sort of had to start with hypotheses and try to disprove or prove them. I'm curious to understand more broadly, why was the time frame selected, knowing that it would impose certain restrictions, right? Like I assume that the Blue Ribbon Commission could have had any time frame to do this study and to operate. Why restrict it to this shorter time frame that may or may not adversely impact the quality of the information that is produced and ultimately the quality and the efficacy of the recommendations that you ultimately make, given that this is trying to attack such a huge problem and solve for such a big issue?
Sure. So, I mean, I can only speak for what I think we hope to accomplish, right? And if we're talking about potential policy recommendations, being able to have those policy recommendations to the legislature at the start of the legislative session, as opposed to after the legislative session or in the midst of the legislative session, could have an impact. It's part of the reason why we have Representative Curry and Representative Hall on the committee, so that they can help with, sort of shepherding any recommendations that may come forward.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, it's really primarily so that you can get this information in time for the next legislative session as opposed to having to wait a year to get that in place,
Correct.
to
If
make those
there's-
recommendations.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for your time and for the information. I don't see any other hands up, but if anyone else has additional questions, please feel free to jump in. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for your time. Those of you from the Blue Ribbon Commission, if you wish to jump off the meeting, you're welcome to. If you want to stay for the remainder of the meeting, you're welcome to stay as well. That said, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the review of the Title IX changes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. And I will pass it to
Deputy Foster.
Deputy Foster to discuss the changes.
Hi there. Good evening, board members. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm just going to tee it up and give the high level, and then I'll turn it over to, I think, Joanne Tremblay Jackson, who can walk you through some of the details. But we also have Attorney Wilson here, and also Director Bergenholtz, all of whom have been part of the work. So the high level framing for this is, as you may have heard, the federal government released new Title IX regulations. Those new regulations go into effect this school year, and those impact really any. Well, I think K-12, actually higher ed technically as well, education institutions that receive federal funding nationwide. And what we have in front of you tonight is actually, it's more than one board policy, and there's a reason for that. We have to change our own Title IX, our own policy around harassment to make sure we're in compliance with the new Title IX regulations from the federal government. But as we explored those new regulations, we also identified other policies that have to be changed in order to be consistent with the new regulations. So that's my very high level overview of what we have in front of you tonight. And as is our custom, what we tend to do with policies is what we try to bring you is essentially a red line each time there's a policy change. There are occasionally exceptions when, for example, it's a brand new policy or it's sort of a rip and replace, if you will, where we just are taking out an old policy and putting in a new one. But in this case, what we provided is a red line where you can see the changes. And so I'm going to hand it over, I think, Joanne, to you to give sort of a quick overview of kind of what the changes are across each of the policies we have in front of you tonight.
Thank you. So we'll start, I think, with the actual Title IX policy. If you're going to pull that up.
I think your microphone might be very low. I don't hear you quite as well as I did the other speakers. I'm not sure if that's everyone else's experience.
Yeah, same.
Better now.
You still sound quite distant.
Oh, technology is wonderful and horrible. Can you hear me or not? I can talk.
I can hear you. It's just very low.
Okay, I apologize for that.
Teacher voice, Joanne.
I'm trying to use my teacher voice. Okay, so this is we're replacing sort of. All right, and I want to explain this is that the new Title IX final rule 2024 has part of its stipulation is that we need to keep in existence the policy that we had effective 2020 with the Title IX rules back in 2020 that were in operation and effective through until August 1, 2024. In case we receive an allegation of something that occurred last school year or before when the 2020 rules were in effect, so that we would investigate and use the procedures and regulations that we have in place with the 2020 Title IX policy. So that is why it is not a red line. It is an actual additional Title IX policy and regulation that will both for students and personnel. for both sides of the operation. Often we have separate policies, but in this case, they coalesce so that it covers whether it's a student to student issue, whether it is a staff to student or student to staff or amongst staff members. So the policy itself is rather succinct. However, the regulation is rather laborious to get through. But we did go and we had two different attorneys besides reviewing all of the regulations and the prototypes that were given to us directly from the federal government. So the attorneys were Attorney Kaufman and Attorney Goldberg that also looked things over and assisted us in this long process. And so those are before you to take a look at. So again, we'll have both in play for at least 3 years as we move forward. The one that is from 2020 and the one that would now take effect once you approve it. But in essence, they wanted us to have a policy in effect August 1, which we knew that wasn't going to be able, but we had it in draft. We started drafting. Then, but all of the regulations from Title IX final rule also impacted our non-discrimination policy for both personnel and student. And so that is redlined for you. So you have two redlined policies. One of them is the student 5145-4, and the other one is the staff personnel 4118.11 and 4218.11. And we needed to add that we would not discriminate based on sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, and we would not discriminate in regards to not just pregnancy as we already had, but added or related conditions and lactation. Then we also have a policy that we redlined and we needed to add to, which is the married and pregnant students policy that we've had. So here we had to add, again, pregnant students and students with pregnancy related conditions would receive reasonable accommodations and modifications, and what these modifications may include, including a place for lactation and time to be able to do so if they so choose. So those are the major changes that we've made. And then at the bottom, we've added that it's due to the Title IX Final Rule 2024. And we don't use the term homebound anymore. We use home instruction. They're not bound to their home, so that's why that was crossed out. And student study team is an old term. We now use MTSS, the multi-tiered system of support team.
Just let me know if I need to open another policy.
Those are all of them. The regulations that go with it, the Title IX 2024 regulations off to, yep. Is a completely new regulation to go with the new policy for the Title IX Final Rule 2024.
And board members, you have all of these in your inbox last week for your review.
Chair Fortune, is it okay if I just add a comment?
Of course, please.
Yeah, just, I don't, or actually, it's more of a question, Joanne. Can you just give a quick voiceover of, in the core policy, the sex discrimination, sex harassment policy, what were the big changes? And I thank you for, the covering too, that it's a weird situation we're in because we will maintain two policies side by side for 3 years, as Joanne mentioned. That's a requirement of the rule. But can you just give a quick voiceover of what's different in the core policy?
It changed some of the formal regulations and practices that were in the 2020 policy, where we had it. The 2020 policy required many steps that would take an extensive period of time to accomplish the Title IX investigation. And it dictated how long you needed to give people time for each step, making a Title IX investigation last 90 and more days. So some of those formal processes were reduced so that now we still are investigating. We still have to investigate all witnesses, but the formality of having to send out a letter, wait for a response, make a formal time for an appointment, make sure that the representative and the parent are there, reorganize when the appointment is. We don't have as much wait time for that as we had in the first policy. That's part of the change, all right? But, it's still the same kind of investigation. It's very similar to what we used to do before the 2020 policy was in place, because the 2020 policy put the regulations in K to 12 to be very similar to higher education procedures. We didn't have the one caveat for the 2020 is that young students, even, elementary students, high school students, wouldn't have to go in front of a panel to prove their point the way that you would have to at higher education. So that at least wasn't there for the 2020 rule for K to 12. This policy seems to recognize, again, that we're in an educational environment, that we're working with very young people, and that we are trying to work with people and educate them, and help them learn how to appropriately behave and what is considered okay and not okay for touch and for interaction, as well. But it still protects that, if a staff person did something egregious against a student, then that the same rules apply, that we have to do a formal investigation. We cannot do mediation if it's a staff person that was involved. If it's a student to student, then of mediation is a possibility and an educational process rather than a formal investigation if all parties agree to it and it's voluntary. And they can change their mind anytime in that process. It also, as we did to this, the non-discrimination policy, it added a few items in there to make sure that sex stereotypes, sex characteristics were included. And so if someone discriminates on that basis, we would need to investigate as well. It still continues the same Title IX that we cannot separate the sexes and treat them differently based on sex. And it pertains to all avenues and aspects of education, including athletics, after-school activities, things of that nature. We can't treat parents and family members differently because of their marital status. That is very clear now in these regulations. There's a lot of things that are the same, but some of the formality for the formal process has been changed for K to 12 so that, again, you can work with individuals in a more expedited manner and a less formal manner. So it's less like a courtroom, if that makes it digestible to everyone.
Thank you for that explanation. Do we have any questions? I don't see any hands up. Just wanted to make sure I'm giving an opportunity for folks to ask questions. I do have one general question. Now,
Sure.
is HPS updating this policy itself based on the changes to the law, or is there some guidance that's issued? Because, you know, all school districts have to do this as a federal law, and all schools are subject to this, or is there some guidance that schools can widely apply? So in other words, if I look at what another school in Connecticut or anywhere else is doing to its own policies, will it be that essentially a carbon copy of this because you're following a template or best practices for the recommended changes? Or is there further customization among each district as to how they revise their policies?
The federal rule came out with a prototype or an exemplar, all right, of what to use for K-12 schools, things that should be involved or included in the policy, as well as in the regulation and the steps. Those are outlined, and there are documents. One of them is called the Summary of Key Provisions. Another one is called the Basic Overview and Facts. Another one is the Total Final Rule. There are multiple documents they gave out to all schools and all school systems to consider when they're revising and reviewing.
Thank you. That exactly answers my question. But please go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that with this one, we do this with many of our policies. We take a look, oftentimes CABE, and for the viewing audience, the Connecticut Association of Boards of Ed, we'll often look at model policies they have as well to make sure we're not, you know, out of step with their model policies.
Right, we reviewed that, and then we, as I stated earlier, we also had an attorney come and work with the core team from the district. That would be, you know, Peter and myself and 2 other individuals that often work with Title IX. I'm their Title IX coordinator for the system, and Peter's my deputy, shall we say, for Title IX. And we had Rebecca Goldberg initially meet with us for a caucus in July, the end of July, over this from Bersham and Moses. And then we also discussed the options that we had and what we were doing, and saw some prototypes from Goldberg and from Melinda Kaufman from Pullman and Cromley. And we also have prototypes that were given to us from Shipman and Goodwin. So we looked at all of those along with ATIXA that had a version that's a federal group, besides the federal government's options and prototypes that they sent us as well.
Thank you very much for this information. Any other questions? All right, seeing no questions, I think this concludes the substantive part of the meeting. Do I need a motion, Christina, to adjourn, or should we simply
No.
adjourn?
You can simply adjourn.
All right. This meeting is here to adjourn. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Have a good night, all.
Good night.